The Wild Robot, words and pictures by Peter Brown, read today with permission from Little Brown and Company. Chapter 6, The Climb. Crack, thunk, clang. Roz was having a little trouble climbing the cliffs. She had a new dent on her rear end and a long scrape down her side. And she was just about to get another ding when a crab scuttled out from under a piece of driftwood. The crab looked up and immediately showed off his giant claws. Everyone was afraid of his giant claws, but not the robot. She just looked down and introduced herself. "Hello, crab. My name is Roz." After a brief standoff, the crab cautiously backed away, and that's when Roz noticed how easily he moved over the rocks. With his wide stance and grippy feet, the crab could crawl up and down any rock face. Roz decided to try out his climbing technique. She spread her arms wide and clamped each of her hands onto the cliffside. She jammed one foot onto a crack and lifted her other foot onto a narrow ledge. And just like that, she was climbing. Roz moved awkwardly at first. A chunk of rock crumbled in her hand and she had trouble finding footholds, but as she climbed higher and higher, she started to get the hang of it. Seagulls squawked from their cliff nests and soared away when the robot came too close. But Roz paid them no mind. She was focused only on getting to the top. Up and up and up she went, methodically, climbing past the nests and ledges and tiny trees rooted in the cracks. And before long, our robot felt the soft soil of the island beneath her feet. Chapter 7, The Wilderness. Animal sounds filled the forest. Chirps, wing beats, and rustlings in the underbrush. And then, from the sea cliffs, there came new sounds. Heavy crunching footsteps. The forest animals fell silent, and from their hiding places they watched as sparkling monsters stomped past. The forest was not a comfortable place for Roz. Jagged rocks, fallen trees, tangled underbrush made it difficult for her to walk. She stumbled along, struggling to keep her balance until her foot snagged and she toppled over like a piece of timber. It wasn't a bad fall, no dings, no dents, just dirt. But Roz was programmed to keep herself in good working order, and once she was back on her feet, she immediately began cleaning herself off. Her hands darted around her body, quickly brushing and picking off every speck of dirt. Only when the robot was sparkling again did she continue through the forest. Roz stumbled on until she found a patch of ground that was flat and open and carpeted with pine needles. It seemed like a safe place, and safety was all the robot really wanted. So she stood there motionless, all perfect, the lines and angles set against the irregular shapes of the wilderness. Chapter 8, Pine Cones. If you stand in a forest long enough, eventually something will fall on you. And Roz had been standing in the forest long enough. A gentle wind whispered through the treetops, and then thunk! A pine cone bounced off of her head. The robot looked down and watched the pine cone roll to a stop. It seemed harmless, so Roz went right back to doing nothing. A few hours later, a gust of wind rushed through the treetops and then thunk! The robot looked down as another pine cone rolled away. And then, a few hours after that, a howling wind tore through the treetops. It bent trunks. It shook branches. And then, thunk, 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 pine cones began raining down. Thunk, thunk. Roz felt something like annoyance. Thunk! She quickly scanned the area for someplace safe from the pine cones, and she spotted the perfect place when she looked up from the huge, rocky shape that towered above the forest. Chapter 9, The Mountain. Roz was now stomping her way up the mountain. Dense forest and rocky outcrops forced the robot to zig and zag and backtrack. But after an hour of steady hiking, she arrived at the craggy mountain peak. Grasses and flowers and shrubs sprouted from every pocket of soil, but there were no trees at the top. Roz was safe from those annoying pine cones. She dusted herself off and then carefully climbed up, leaning on the leaning slab of stone to the very highest point of the entire mountain. The robot slowly turned her head completely around, and she saw the ocean stretching to the horizon in every direction. And in that moment, Roz learned what you and I have known since the beginning of this story. In that moment, Roz finally realized that she was on an island. Roz looked down and surveyed the island. Starting from the sandy southern point, the island grew wider and greener and hillier until it finally jutted up until the rocky cone of the mountain. In some places, the mountain fell away, leaving sheer cliffs. A waterfall rushed off one cliff and fed a river that wound its way through the great meadow in the center of the island. The river flowed past the wildflowers and ponds and boulders and then disappeared into the forest. Blurry shapes suddenly cut through the robot's vision. She refocused her eyes and saw vultures circling above the foothills. And then she noticed lizards warming themselves on a distant rock. A badger peeked out from a berry bush. A moose waded through a stream. A flock of sparrows turned in perfect unison above the trees. The island was teeming with life, and now it had a new kind of life, a strange kind of life, artificial life. Chapter 10, The Reminder. I should remind you, reader, that Roz had no idea how she had come to be on that island. She didn't know that she had been built in a factory and then stored in a warehouse before crossing the ocean on a cargo ship. She didn't know that a hurricane had sunk the ship and left her crate floating on the waves for days until it finally washed ashore. She didn't know that she had been accidentally activated by those curious sea otters as the robot looked out at the island. It never occurred to her that she might not belong there. As far as Roz knew, she was home. Chapter 11, The Robot Sleeps. Roz stood on the peak and watched the sun behind the ocean. She watched the shadows slowly spread over the island and up the mountainside. She watched the stars come out one by one until the sky was filled with a million points of light. It was the first night of the robot's life. She activated her headlights, and suddenly bright shafts of light were beaming out from her eyes and illuminating the whole mountaintop. Too bright. She dimmed them. Then she turned them off and sat in darkness and listened to the chorus of nighttime chirps. After a while, our robot's computer brain decided it was a good time to conserve energy. So she sat and anchored her hands to the rocks. Her non essential programs were switched off. And then, in her own way, the robot slept. Chapter 12, The Storm. Roz felt safe up on the mountaintop, so she spent the next few days and nights perched on the peak. But everything changed one afternoon when a low-flying cloud crept up the mountain, and Roz found herself surrounded by white. When the world faded back into view, she noticed more clouds floating south past the island. When she heard a deep rumble behind her, the robot turned her head around and saw that the sky was filled with a swirling wall of darkness. Light flickered here and there, More deep rumbles. A storm was approaching, and it wasn't just any storm. It was as fierce as the one that had sent the cargo ship to the ocean floor. The wind picked up, and the first drops of rain tapped against the robot. It was time to go. Roz unclapped her hands and began sliding down the peak. Hot sparks flew from where her body scraped against the leaning slab of stone. As soon as her feet hit the soil, she was off and running. The rain fell harder. The wind blew faster. The lightning flashed brighter. The thunder cracked louder. So much rainwater was falling that rushing rivers of runoff started springing up everywhere. Roz splashed down the mountain, searching through the gloom for any kind of shelter. But she should have watched where she was going. Her heavy feet slipped and tripped and tumbled right onto a mudslide. Our robot was helpless. The river of mud whisked her downhill, slamming her onto the rocks and dragging her through bushes and sweeping her straight toward a cliff. Mud was pouring off the cliff like a waterfall. Roz frantically clawed at the ground, grasping for anything she could hold onto, but the flow only carried her faster toward the edge. And she was just about to plunge over the side when she came to a hard, sudden stop. Mud surged all around her, spraying into her face and pinning her against something solid. She blindly felt with her hands, recognizing the thick roots and trunk of a pine tree. In an instant, she was pulling herself into the branches. Wind whipped across the mountainside, and Roz heard a familiar thunk of pine cones pelting her body. She didn't mind them. She was just happy to be safe from the mud flow. The robot locked her arms and legs around the tree and waited for the storm to blow over. Chapter 13, The Aftermath. Daybreak, and the storm had passed. But the sounds of water were everywhere. The air was filled with dripping sounds of mountain runoff and the sloshing sounds of flooded streams. And then came a very different sound. It was the clanging sound made when a robot slips on a wet rock. There were quite a few clangs that morning. As Roz worked her way downhill, she scanned for the aftermath of the storm. Giant mounds of mud and debris had formed below the cliffs. The island's central river had crested its banks and spilled into the nearby fields and forests. Some trees had been uprooted, others were submerged, their upper branches barely poking out above the floodwaters, their lower branches swarming with fish instead of birds. After such a storm, you might expect to see animal corpses scattered among all the devastation, but the animals seemed to have survived just fine. Somehow, they had known a storm was coming, and they found shelter long before it rolled in. Lowland creatures who had sought refuge on higher ground were waiting patiently for the water to recede. Deer were wading through the flooded fields. Beavers were busy collecting a trove of fallen branches. Geese honked in the sky before splashing down into watery sections of the forest. Clearly, these animals were experts at survival. Clearly, the robot was not. Roz was crusted with mud and grit, so she gave herself another good cleaning, but that only revealed dents and scratches. They were really starting to add up. She hardly resembled that perfect robot who had appeared on the shore just a week earlier. The wilderness was taking its toll on poor Roz, so she felt something like relief when she spotted the quiet hole in the side of the mountain. It looked like a safe place for a robot. She stomped across the hillside and up to the cave, but never stopped to wonder what might be lurking within. Dun dun dun! Until next week, guys, we'll read chapters 14 through 20 of The Wild Robot. Have a great week. Bye.